When I was in high school, one of the sayings that some of my classmates knew me by was, "I'm not a Christian, I believe in the Bible." I had aunts and uncles on both sides of my family that were deep thinking and deeply religious, but not Nicene Christians. Beyond them, one of my dad's best friends was a thoughtful elder in a Baptist church, and one of my mom's best friends was a thoughtful woman that had become an Episcopalian nun before I was an adult. It was her that introduced me to the logical fallacy that I would come to most associate with mainstream and conservative Christianity for most of my life: begging the question. If you're not familiar, begging the question is the worst named of the classical logical fallacies. It's so bad that the lay use of the term has nothing to do with the logical fallacy. In lay usage, most people say something begs the question when it causes you to think of the next question. For example, if I say that my wife isn't home, that begs the question, where is she? I'm not the kind of person to say that this is wrong. I don't think language works like that. However, it is important to note the context when the term is used, because if you enter this conversation with the lay understanding of begging the question, you'll be very confused. The classic logical fallacy called begging the question is also sometimes called a circular argument. It's when you assume the answer you're trying to show, and then use the results of that assumption to prove the answer. For example, an argument that I heard a lot back in the day from Christians was, comic books and Dungeons and Dragons are bad because it encourages bad behavior, and you can see that because people who do one tend to start doing the other. Through my teenage years and young adult life, I saw so many arguments in Christianity that were based on begging the question that it killed any desire I might have had to be associated with that movement. And since I had such good teachers of forming thought so early, it never occurred to me that these people honestly didn't understand what they were doing. I didn't realize that begging the question is a very subtle fallacy on a number of fronts. For one thing, there are good and right ways to use the results of the assumption in a more robust argument. If you examine the results of multiple assumptions, for example, then each individual examination might look like begging the question, but if you then compare the results of each assumption against an objective source, then you can see which is more likely to be true. This is called comparing competing hypotheses. There is also experimentation, which is how the scientific method works. That's when you start with a theory, you state what the results of an experiment will be if the theory is true and how that will be different if the theory is false, then you run the experiment. In this situation, the only functional difference between a theory and a temporary assumption is that theory sounds cooler. There's also reductio ad absurdum, when you assume something is true and show how that leads to false conclusions. For example, we know that Newton didn't invent gravity, because if we assume that he did, we have to explain how everyone stayed on Earth before Newton. So not everyone that starts with an assumption is automatically begging the question. Another way that begging the question is subtle is that a particular assumption can be such a fundamental part of how someone interacts with the world that they feel confident about it and never consider that it is an assumption. This was why heliocentric theory had such a hard time getting off the ground in ancient Greek. Everything falls towards the Earth, so what could possibly cause things to orbit around the sun? Except it turned out that the assumption that everything falls towards the Earth is wrong, so that was a false assumption, no matter how natural it felt. One of the clearest ways to tell if someone is begging the question is to inverse the assumption that is being assumed, and see if the new logic holds up. In the course of my investigation of Hebrew Matthew, one of the objections that I run into regularly is Matthew explains the definition to his audience any time that he uses Hebrew or Aramaic, and he wouldn't need to do that if it were written in Hebrew. I say that this is begging the question, and to check that I'll inverse the assumption and see if it holds up. The inverted assumption then becomes Matthew does not explain the definition to his audience any of the times that he uses Hebrew and Aramaic in manuscripts that descend from the original, because it's already in Hebrew. And since I have a manuscript that I think descends from the original, I can test this inverted assumption. The manuscript that I will use for this evaluation is the Paris manuscript. On the one hand, since the assumption starts with a Hebrew manuscript of Matthew, this is kinda problematic to examine. Since every verse of the manuscript is in Hebrew, I would have to show that every verse is without an explanation. I happen to know that there's no place in the entire Paris manuscript that Matthew explains his definitions, but the only way to actually prove that is to give the entire manuscript one verse at a time and state no explanation given here. But there's a way we can shortcut this that will be more relevant to most of the people that are begging this particular question. There are a few places that the Greek translator added explanations for Hebrew or Aramaic that they left untranslated. Most people will be satisfied to assume that the verses that don't have such an explanation in Greek won't have it in Hebrew either, so unless someone can provide another specific verse that they think this is a problem for, I think we can limit ourselves to these few verses and their lack of explanation in the Paris manuscript. These verses are Matthew 1 verse 23, Matthew 27 verse 33, Matthew 27 verse 46, and then I'll give an honorable mention to Matthew 9 verse 25. I will give the King James and the Greek for each of these, then a translation from the Paris manuscript along with the Hebrew, then the parallels in Mark and Luke if I think they are relevant. Then I will examine whether or not there is an explanation for Hebrew or Aramaic in the Hebrew text. Since most of the explanations are at the end of the verse, I'll include the next verse to show that I'm not hiding the definition behind a verse break. Matthew 1 verse 23. Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is, God with us. Then Joseph being raised from sleep did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him, and took unto him his wife.
Ιδού, η παρθένος εγκαστρεί 6 και τέξεται ιών, και καλέσουσιν το όνομα αυτού Εμμανουήλ, ο εστί μεθερμινευόμενον, μεθ, ημών ο Θεός. Διεγερθείς δε ο Ιωσήφ από του ύπνου, επίησένος προσέταξεν αυτό ο άγγελος Κυρίου και παρέλαβεν τη γυναίκα αυτού.
The young woman became pregnant, and she birthed a son, and called his name Emmanuel. And Joseph arose from his sleep, and he did as the angel of the Lord commanded, and took her as his wife.
העלמה הרע ויולדת בן וקראת שמו עמנואל ויקץ יוסף משנתו ויעש כאשר ציווה אותו מלאך יהובה ולקח אותה לאישה.
We can see that the explanation of what Emmanuel means is not supplied by the Hebrew text. Matthew 27 verse 33. And when they were come unto a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull, they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall, and when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink.
Και ελθόντες εις τόπον λεγόμενον Γολγοθά, ο εστιν λεγόμενος κρανίου τόπος, έδωκαν αυτό πχήν όξος μετά χολής μεμιγμένον και γευσάμενος ουκ ήθελεν πχήν.
And they came to the place that is called Golgotha, and they gave him wine mixed with gall. And when he tasted it, he refused to drink.
ויבואו אל המקום שנאמר גלגלתיה ויתנו לא יין מהול ברוש וכשת העם וימאן לשתבות.
We see that the name Golgotha is given and not explained. Matthew 27 verse 46. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani? That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Some of them that stood there when they heard that, said, This man calleth for Elias.
Περίδε την ενάτην ώραν ανεβόησεν ο Ιησούς φωνή μεγάλη, λέγον, Ηλί, Ηλί, λιμά σαβαχθανή. Τούτ, έστιν, Θεέ μου, ίνα τη μ' εγκατέλειπες. Τινές δε τον εκεί εστώτον ακούσαντες έλεγον, ότι Ηλίαν φωνή ούτως.
And in the 9th hour Jesus called in a loud voice and said, My God, lama sabachthani. And some of the men said when they heard, He's calling for Elijah.
ובשעה תשיעית קרא ישו בקול גדול ויאמר אלי, אלי למה שכחתני וקצת אנשים אמרו כששמעו אמרו לאליה זה קורא.
Mark 15 verse 34. And at the 9th hour Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? Which is, being interpreted, My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Και τη ώρα τη ενάτη εβόησεν ο Ιησούς φωνή μεγάλη, λέγον, Ελοή, Ελοή, λιμά σαβαχθανή. Ο εστί μεθερμινευόμενον, ο Θεός μου, εις τι μ' εγκατέλειπες.
Once again, there is no explanation of what the Hebrew/Aramaic means. One of the things that's interesting about the Greek in this place is that Eli is the Hebrew pronunciation of that word, but sabachthani is an Aramaic word. In the parallel from Mark, Eloi is the Aramaic pronunciation. Neither Hebrew nor Aramaic were written with vowels until hundreds of years later, so it's impossible to tell which pronunciation the Hebrew text originally preferred. I have added vowel points to the Paris manuscript transcription, but they were not original. It is interesting, though, that the Greek version of Matthew switches between the two where Mark remains consistently Aramaic. This also gives a hint that if the Hebrew really did come first, sometimes the translator from Hebrew to Greek might have been just a little confused when they came across Aramaic in the text. Not like they couldn't read it, but like it was shifting too many gears all at the same time and leads to confusion. I'll come back to this later. Matthew 9 verse 25. Matthew 9 verse 25 is a little bit different. The Greek doesn't transliterate any Hebrew or Aramaic here. That would seem to put this text outside the scope of today's project. However, the Hebrew does have an Aramaic quote in it. But when the people were put forth, he went in, and took her by the hand, and the maid arose.
Ότε δε εξευλήθη ο όχλος, εισελθόν εκράτησεν της χειρός αυτής, και ηγέρθη το κοράσιον.
And when the crowd was sent away, he entered and he took her hand and he said, Kumi. And the girl arose.
וכשהושלח ההמון, נכנס הוא ויחזק בידיו ויאמר קומי קומי ותקום הנערה.
Mark 5 verses 40 to 41. And they laughed him to scorn. But when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, and them that were with him, and entereth in where the damsel was lying. And he took the damsel by the hand, and said unto her, Talitha cumi, which is, being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise.
Και κατεγέλων αυτού. Ο δε, εκβαλών πάντας, παραλαμβάνει τον πατέρα του παιδίου και τη μητέρα και τους μετ, αυτού, και εισπορεύεται όπου είναι το παιδίον ανακείμενον. Και κρατήσας της χειρός του παιδίου, λέγει αυτή, Ταλιθά, κούμιο εστι μεθερμινεφόμενον, το κοράσιον, συλλέγω, έγειρε.
Luke 8 verse 54. And he put them all out, and took her by the hand, and called, saying, Maid, arise.
Αυτός δε εκβαλών έξω πάντας, και κρατήσας της χειρός αυτής, εφώνησεν λέγον, υπές, εγείρου.
This is a case where we can kind of see the development of the text in action. Mark was written first, and we can see how both the Hebrew text of the Paris manuscript and Luke are a paraphrase of that. Then we can see that the translation of Matthew from Hebrew to Greek tries to incorporate elements from both Mark and Luke. Luke's text and Matthew's text both abbreviate Mark, so it makes sense for the translator to try to follow what Luke is doing, but in the process Jesus' words end up dropping out. This isn't the only case where we see the Paris manuscript drifting closer to Mark or further from Luke, but it is the only one that I've seen that has Aramaic in it, so it's the only one relevant to the current topic. It's also not the only place where the translator seems to struggle where there's Aramaic. Remember the mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic in 27:46. These features of the Paris manuscript, of having a confused translation where there's Aramaic text, of drifting closer to Mark where there's a parallel, and of drifting away from Luke, all of which seem to somewhat favor the theory of Markan priority, does invite a particular question, though, why does a 16th century manuscript show evidence for a 19th century theory of textual development? Let's put our hypotheses in competition. If we assume that Matthew was written in Greek and the Hebrew text in this family is a translation, then the explanation is simple. The person behind this text was a genius that was centuries ahead of his time in studying textual development, and the only sign he left behind was the text in this family of manuscripts. If we assume that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, the explanation is also simple. The church fathers who said that Matthew was written in Hebrew were correct, but those who claimed Matthew wrote first were in error, and this family of manuscripts descend from that original. To be clear, I don't feel that anything I've offered here is evidence in favor or against Matthew being originally written in Hebrew or Greek. The reader may choose to believe in an early medieval genius or a secret line of manuscripts at the reader's discretion. Based only on what's in this short chapter, both of them could sound fairly outlandish depending on the reader's background. This chapter is not aimed at providing solid evidence for one side or the other. This is simply aimed at demonstrating that the argument that Matthew provides translation of Hebrew or Aramaic words is begging the question, and does not actually provide evidence regarding the original language when considered more carefully. The positive case for Hebrew Matthew is presented in another place.